U.S. President Donald Trump announced a 10% tariff on Canadian energy. Could Canada help replace Russian raw materials and even some of its energy deliveries to Germany, with the West shunning Russian energy? Global suppliers scrambled to make up the shortfall, and one of those countries is Qatar, which has been making long-term supply deals with European and Asian partners. Recently, Qatar announced that it expects to sign more contracts this year. A 10% tariff on Canada's natural gas and energy sector is just one announcement, but President Trump has triggered an explosion that has changed the global energy landscape. This move inadvertently ignited a spectacular flip-flop that has rocked America's energy position. Not only Canada but even before Washington had time to regroup after announcing tariffs on 180 countries, Qatar simultaneously redirected its gas exports straight to Europe. Imagine those massive pipelines, instead of flowing to Texas or New York, now eagerly converging on Germany, France, and even the United Kingdom. This opened up a new era of cooperative alliances. Now, what will Washington do when the allies who once sailed in the same boat suddenly turn their backs? Could a new tariff counterattack to Canada and Qatar force Trump to change his mind? Let's uncover the answers in today's video. And don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of our latest updates. At the beginning of 2025, Trump decided to impose a 10% tariff on crude oil and gas imported from Canada, immediately after his second inauguration. The Trump administration inadvertently ignited an unprecedented crisis in energy relations between the two countries. According to Reuters, Canada accounted for nearly 50% of the total crude oil imported by the U.S., estimated at up to 4 million barrels per day. But starting in March 2025, this entire energy supply suddenly faced a tariff equal to 1/10 of its value, a move that completely distorted the rules of the game that had existed for decades between the two sides. This decision not only dealt a blow to U.S. refining companies struggling with a shortage of cheap and stable supplies but also forced Ottawa to seek a new harbor for millions of barrels of gas each day, as the U.S. was consuming 90% of Canada's oil exports. Instead of flowing to Texas or Louisiana as before, Canadian liquefied natural gas, LNG, exports are now being redirected to Europe, where countries are racing to stockpile in order to deal with the post-Russia energy crisis. The IEA recorded that in the first quarter of 2025, Europe's LNG imports surged by 23% year-on-year, equivalent to over 9 billion cubic meters of additional gas. At the same time, Qatar, a giant that has long quietly held the world's lowest LNG export costs, quickly jumped into the gap. According to Reuters, Doha is planning to expand capacity from 77 million tons per year to 142 million tons by 2030, an increase of nearly 85%, in order to boost exports to Europe and Asia. This move shows that Qatar is not only observing but also proactively seizing the opportunity presented by the U.S. tariff shock to elevate its position, forcing Washington to reassess its energy strategy and its traditional alliances with long-standing partners. From the initial tariff package to the wave of global energy realignment, the backdrop of this dispute has gradually revealed a new geopolitical gamble, where economic interests and strategic power are being reshaped by the hour. In mid-2025, when the 10% tariff on all natural gas imports from Canada officially took effect, Washington did not anticipate that this would be the jolt initiating an unprecedented strategic turning point in the North American energy sector. At that time, the United States was the sole outlet for Canada's gas. According to data from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, Canada exported about 8.66 billion cubic feet per day via pipeline to the U.S. in 2024, up from 8.0 billion cubic feet per day in 2023, and an average of 7.5 billion cubic feet per day over the previous 5 years, 2018 to 2022. This compares with the record 10.4 BCFD reached in 2002. Suddenly, this volume, nearly half of U.S. refinery and power plant demand, became more expensive, forcing Ottawa to seek an escape toward Europe and Asia. This was not merely a unilateral punishment of an ally. Trump also appeared to be sending an indirect signal, striking back after trade tensions with China. Wasting no time, Canada accelerated the LNG Canada project at Kitimat, British Columbia, its first liquefied natural gas export facility with a capacity of 14 million tons of LNG per year and a first shipment slated for mid-2025. The project is Ottawa's trump card to recoup losses and expand into European and Asian markets. Images of giant LNG carriers leaving Port Kitimat have become emblematic of Canada's energy pivot, but this strategy extends far beyond a single new plant. Canada is expanding its entire infrastructure network, from the 670 kilometers coastal GasLink pipeline to ports and storage facilities, with the goal of escaping the U.S. market. The 40 billion Canadian dollars pipeline, capable of carrying 2 billion cubic feet per day, now links the Montney gas fields directly to the export terminal, allowing Canada to sell straight to distant customers without crossing the U.S. border. The impact was immediate. The flow of cheap gas to the U.S. began to shrink, driving gasoline prices in eastern states up by 20 to 40 cents per gallon in the first month of the tariff, according to industry experts and distributors. Thousands of workers at refineries, ports, and processing plants felt the squeeze, most notably Stellantis, which halted production and laid off 900 workers at its Windsor, Michigan, facility alone due to higher import costs for parts and fuel. That figure has since climbed to 4,500. Never has a seemingly small tariff decision triggered such a sweeping flip. Canada has shown remarkable agility in turning crisis into opportunity, while the U.S. now faces a wrenching dilemma: how to maintain energy stability and protect millions of jobs when a protective policy has inadvertently induced shortages and price spikes. What do you think of Trump's decision against Canada? Leave your thoughts in the comments below so we can discuss further. While Canada is pivoting its energy strategy, Qatar is not standing still. From exporting 77 million tons of LNG per year in 2024, Doha has already laid out a roadmap to boost capacity to 142 million tons by 2030, an increase of nearly 85% in just the next 6 years. This lies at the heart of the North Field expansion project, the engine that will propel Qatar to become the global LNG superpower, ready to command almost 25% of the world market by the end of this decade. And Qatar isn't stopping at raw capacity figures. It has proactively signed long-term contracts with a host of European giants. In October 2023, Qatar Energy and Total Energies inked a 27-year deal to supply 3.5 million tons of LNG per year to France, running from 2026 through the mid-2050s. Just days later, Doha sealed another 27-year agreement with Shell in the Netherlands for 2 million tons annually. Decisive moves aimed at replacing Russian gas at a time when the EU is still scrambling for alternatives. In fact, Europe's demand for liquefied gas is surging. The International Energy Agency, IEA, forecasted that EU LNG imports will climb 25% in 2025, an extra 33 billion cubic meters year-on-year, pushing volumes close to record highs. The main driver is the sharp drop in piped Russian supply after flows through Nord Stream and other pipelines nearly halted, forcing Europe to make up the shortfall with imported LNG. At the same time, storage needs have spiked. End-of-winter inventories were only 34% full, so tanks must be replenished to 90% capacity before next winter to ensure adequate heating for European households. However, Qatar's deals face headwinds from the EU's new stringent environmental rules, such as the Due Diligence Directive, which mandates that gas suppliers must meet carbon and human rights standards, along with new reporting requirements coming in 2027. These regulations have placed Doha in a leveraged position, where it is ready to invoke exemptions or even threaten to halt supplies if heavily penalized, all to preserve its reputation for low-cost, reliable deliveries. This is happening even as the U.S. government ramps up its own LNG exports to reclaim market share. However, domestic infrastructure lags, with pipelines and export terminals remaining inadequate. At Sierra Week in March 2025, industry leaders warned that without more large-scale pipelines and deep-water ports, U.S. export capacity will face bottlenecks despite the highest demand in 15 years. Moreover, The two new U.S. LNG plants are not expected online until 2026 to 2027, meaning European buyers will have to either wait or turn to Qatar as the fast alternative for at least the next 2 years. In the race for Europe's energy business, Qatar not only enjoys the world's lowest production costs but also wins the trade war of words, consistently extending long-term partnership offers. Meanwhile, Washington faces domestic energy security pressures and slight price upticks at home due to export competition. Qatar, with its unrivaled position, is proving it can do more than just fill the Russian gas gap. It's the hunter, seizing opportunities while the U.S. scrambles to build its infrastructure. When Europe was faced with an unprecedented geopolitical turning point, hurriedly seeking sustainable alternatives after the main gas pipeline from Russia through Ukraine was shut off because Ankara and Moscow did not renew the agreement, this event drove Russia's share of the EU's total gas supply from 40% before the conflict to below 10% in just a few months. This forced member states to sign long-term contracts with Ottawa and Doha to fill the energy gap, with the mindset of ensuring no more cold winters. Brussels swiftly targeted liquefied natural gas, LNG, projects from Canada and Qatar. A recent draft by the European Commission revealed a plan to invest directly in LNG export facilities abroad in order to secure a stable supply, despite high costs and political risks. Canada, via the LNG Canada project, and Qatar, through its massive contracts with Total Energies, Shell, and others, have become new pillars, providing the EU with a solid energy shield for at least the next 2 decades. No longer merely a commodity, LNG has now become a powerful diplomatic tool. Qatar has exploited all of the EU's environmental exemptions to export at competitive prices, while Canada has leveraged its G7 ally status to negotiate favorable terms. According to the IEA, the flow of LNG into Europe now accounts for over 35% of total gas imports, and the bloc is considering building a 20 billion cubic meter strategic reserve to minimize disruption risks. Meanwhile, American consumers, even though the U.S. is viewed as a winner in the global LNG market, are bearing the direct consequences. Domestic natural gas prices have risen nearly 80% year-over-year, primarily due to record volumes being funneled to LNG export terminals and the knock-on effects of the Trump administration's tariff policy. The result has been heating and electricity bills in many eastern states soaring by hundreds of dollars each cold season. As Washington pushes exports to assert its position, domestic infrastructure, from pipelines to ports, lags behind, creating the paradox that, despite being an energy superpower, Americans remain anxious about prices and supply stability. From the 10% tariff on Canadian gas to the new energy map redrawn by Canada and Qatar, the U.S. now faces a brutal quandary: how to balance global economic interests with the immediate well-being of millions of American families. Should President Trump really reconsider his punitive tariffs in light of these unfolding consequences, borne not by foreign rivals but by his own citizens?